Irwin Cotler and I go back a long way, back to Montreal, back to McGill, back to the debating union. And even then, he loved argumentation, he loved polemic, he loved dialectic. We used to go on and on and on in the night. Even during exam period, as I remember, we used to say to each other, we got to get back to the studies, but we'd stay with the discussion. So it was no surprise at all for me that he emerged as a defender of the refuseniks in the former Soviet Union, a defender of Mandela in the former South Africa. These days, however, he's taken on rather a reverse role as a kind of prosecutor. He's taking a stand against impunity in Sudan and the Darfur. He's taking a stand against genocidal incitement in Iran, and he continues to represent political prisoners around the world against an array of genocidal, apocalyptic maniacs. Irwin?
I'm delighted to be here on this 10th anniversary of IdeaCity. I'm reminded when I think about IdeaCities, if I can paraphrase the words of Margaret Mead, that a small group of people inspired by ideas and moved to action can transform the world. And the kind of discourse that takes place here in IdeaCity, I'm sure will have its transformative impact in Toronto and beyond in the weeks, months, and years ahead. And what I would like to do, and Moses, in fact, perhaps invited this, is share with you some thoughts, some reflections, some concerns about the struggle against indifference, about the struggle against hate, about the struggle against impunity, perhaps most importantly about the struggle against the crime whose name we should even shudder to mention, namely genocide. Indeed, we meet at what I would call an important moment of remembrance and reminder, and hence the approach by way of reflection. For we meet in the aftermath of the 60th anniversary of the Genocide Convention, sometimes spoken of as the Never Again Convention, but which has been tragically violated again and again. On the occasion still of the 15th anniversary of the unspeakable genocide in Rwanda. I say unspeakable genocide in Rwanda because 15 years ago, close to 1 million Rwandans, mostly ethnic Tutsi, some moderate Hutus, were murdered in less than 100 days. On the 6th anniversary of the genocide by attrition in Darfur, it's tragic to think that the crime whose name we should even shudder to mention is taking place yet again, now in the 21st century, and we are in the 6th anniversary of that crime. And so it becomes, I think, not only appropriate but necessary to ask ourselves, 60 years later, what have we learned? And no less important, what must we do? And what I'd like to do is share with you some of the major lessons that have emerged of the last 60 years. This is not an exhaustive list. It may not even be the most important of the lessons. But those lessons which, in my own experience and involvement, seem to be some of the more compelling ones as we confront the present international realities. And the first is the danger of state-sanctioned incitement to genocide. Simply put, the Holocaust and the genocides that followed in Srebrenica, in Rwanda, in Darfur, occurred not only because of the machinery of death, but occurred because of state-sanctioned cultures of hate. It was this teaching of contempt, this demonizing of the other, this is where it all begins. And we are witnessing, yet again, another state-sanctioned incitement to genocide, whose epicenter is Ahmadinejad's Iran. And I use the term Ahmadinejad's Iran because I want to distinguish that from the people and publics of Iran who are otherwise the targets of domestic mass repression, of which the last few days are just metaphor and message of what has become a systematic and indeed systemic domestic repression. And where we are witnessing the toxic convergence of the advocacy of the most horrific of crimes, namely genocide, embedded in the most virulent of hatreds, namely anti-Semitism, underpinned by the acquisition or the attempted acquisition in defiance of UN Security Council resolutions of enriched uranium in the pursuit of atomic weapons, dramatized by the parading in the streets of Tehran, not once, and festooned on billboards in Tehran and the like, of a Shihab-3 missile draped in the emblem, and you've read about this, wipe Israel off the map, but perhaps not the other 4 words that accompany it. As the Imam says, namely that this is a religiously sanctioned incitement to genocide, denying the Holocaust as it incites to a new one, and warning Muslims who, if they recognize Israel, they will burn in the Ummah of Islam, and always, everywhere, massive domestic repression, whether it be against a targeted Baha'i religious minority, or against women, or students, or academics, intellectuals, trade unions, and the like.
When we come back,
the genocides occurred not only because of state-sanctioned cultures of hate, but because of conspiracies of silence, because of crimes of indifference.
Get the latest Idealist news, presenter information, and watch streaming video at www.ideacityonline.com. IdeaCity, the smartest people, the biggest ideas.
And what is so shocking is that as we meet, it is clear, and if the evidence, if time permitted to put before you the evidence rather than the one-liners, what we are seeing now is a comprehensive and compelling incitement that is in standing violation of the genocide's express prohibition against the direct and public incitement to genocide. Let there be no mistake about it. Iran has already committed the crime of incitement to genocide. It has already started down the road to genocide. Professor Gregory Stanton, the president of the International Association of Genocide Scholars, who testified before our Parliamentary Committee, Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on International Human Rights, and who is the architect of a template on the 8 stages of genocide, said that Iran has already passed through the 6 stages of genocide. And at the same time as we say this, it is shocking to appreciate that not one state party in the international community that has an obligation under the Genocide Convention to prevent incitement to genocide has come forward to exercise any of its responsibilities under that Genocide Convention. As Louise Arbour put it, the responsibility to prevent is of the highest legal order. To use the burdensome Latin that lawyers sometimes use, it's called a jus cogens obligations, an overriding obligation in international law. Which brings me to the next danger, and that is the danger of indifference and inaction in the face of incitement, mass atrocity, and the like. In other words, the genocides occurred not only because of state-sanctioned cultures of hate, but because of conspiracies of silence, because of crimes of indifference. What is so unspeakable about the Rwandan genocide is not only the horror of the genocide, which is bad enough, but that this genocide was preventable. Nobody could say that we did not know. We knew, but we did not act. Just as nobody can say with respect to Darfur that we did not know or we do not know. We know, and we are not sufficiently acting here as well. Reminding us of the words of Elie Wiesel when he put it that indifference always means coming down on the side of the victimizer, never on the side of the victim. Which leads me to the third lesson from the last 60 years, the danger of a culture of impunity. If the 20th century was the age of atrocity, it was also the age of impunity. Few of the perpetrators were brought to justice. And so, just as there must not be any sanctuary for hate or any refuge for bigotry and incitement, so must there not be any safe haven for these genocidaires, or sometimes called the hostis humanis generis, the enemies of humankind. And our responsibility is to bring these perpetrators to justice. And as I say this, I'm reminded of the fact of the continuing culture of impunity, because we are now just past the second anniversary of the issuance by the International Criminal Court of an arrest warrant for Ahmed Haroun, person, and his name may not mean much to you, Minister of Humanitarian Affairs in the government of Sudan. And an arrest warrant was issued for him for his having organized, planned, and perpetrated war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide in Darfur. What did the Sudanese government do? Did they surrender Mr. Haroun to the International Criminal Court as they were obliged to do? Not at all. In an Orwellian decision, and I don't like to use Orwellian as it becomes so cliché, but to appreciate what was done here. Not only was Ahmed Haroun not surrendered to the International Criminal Court, but he was promoted by the Sudanese government to be the person in charge of hearing human rights complaints from the very people against whom he perpetrated his atrocities. And which reminds us also of some 5 months ago, when the International Criminal Court issued an unprecedented, and this was the encouraging part, an unprecedented arrest warrant for President al-Bashir of Sudan for his planning and perpetration of war crimes and crimes against humanity. Yet here, once again, not only does the arrest warrant go unenforced, but President al-Bashir continues to be welcomed in many capitals in the international community, thereby nurturing, yet again, the culture of impunity. Which brings me to the fourth lesson. And the fourth lesson is what can perhaps best be called, and was so called by Benda in 1938, la trahison des clercs, the betrayal of the elites, the betrayal by politicians, intellectuals, academics, media, and the like, who rather than hold the perpetrators to account internationally and otherwise, reflect not only a marked indifference, but even nurture this culture of impunity. And so here too, it becomes important to speak in that sense, truth to power, and to hold power to account. And this is true with respect to governments, and this is true with respect to our own government, regardless of party.
When we come back.
So the federal court ordered the Canadian government to return him immediately to Canada. And since it appears courts may no longer trust politicians or governments, they said, we want him brought before us.
Great ideas are meant to be shared. Join the discussion on Facebook. IdeaCity, the smartest people, the biggest ideas.
And I want to bring only just one example, because it is that which is occurring right now as we meet. And that is with respect to a Canadian citizen of Sudanese origin, Abusfian Abdul Razak. As we meet, he has now been languishing in Sudan for 6 years. Much of that time he spent in a Sudanese prison. A recent judgment by the federal court said that CSIS may well have been complicit in Mr. Abdul Razak having landed up in a Sudanese prison where he was tortured. CSIS and the RCMP acknowledge that they have no evidence against him, that he is a security risk. Mr. Abdul Razak has a right under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which was mentioned earlier, a right to return to Canada under Section 6 of the Charter. Canadians bought a ticket for him when, in fact, he was being rebuffed and impeded in his desire to return. And as the federal court in its recent judgment put it, the Canadian government violates the rights of Mr. Abdul Razak and breaches its obligations to him and under the Charter to respect his rights, to respect the Charter, to bring him back to Canada. And so the federal court ordered the Canadian government to return him immediately to Canada. And since it appears courts may no longer trust politicians or governments, they said, we want him brought before us, before the federal court, physically, so we will be able to affirm that he has indeed been returned to Canada and the Canadian government has indeed respected and honored its obligations. And as we meet now, he is still languishing in Sudan. The Canadian government is looking into whether they should appeal the judgment even further so that he will continue to languish in Sudan. And I can best sum it all up by what the court said. They characterized the case of Mr. Abdul Razak as being Kafkaesque. Kafkaesque in all its particulars. Because the government says, well, we can't bring him back. He's on a UN watch list. That doesn't allow him to come back. Yet the UN officials have said, it doesn't impede you, Canada, from bringing him back. You have the right, if not the obligation, to bring him back. And as the federal court put it, even that UN watch list in this case itself has a Kafkaesque character to it. Nobody knows how they got on, how they can get off. The government says to Mr. Abdul Razak, it's up to you to get yourself off the watch list, rather than telling him you have a right to return to Canada. We will honor our obligation to bring you back and honor our obligation to the rule of law and the court decision to return you home to Canada. And this brings me to the last of the lessons, and that is the danger of assaults on the vulnerable. Again, historically, what we have seen has been the danger and the assaults upon the vulnerability of the powerless and the powerlessness of the vulnerable. Dramatized in the Nazi triage of racial hygiene, the Nazi race laws, the euthanasia laws, the laws with respect at that time to sterilization. This triage that targeted those, in their words, quote, whose lives were not worth living. And it's important to be reminded of what Professor Henry Friedlander tells us in his book on the origins of genocide, that the first group singled out for genocide in the Nazi Third Reich were the Jewish disabled, the assault on the powerless and the vulnerability of the powerless. And it's our responsibility in that regard to give voice to the voiceless as we empower the powerless, whoever they may be they the battered woman, be it the refugee, be it the immigrant. And we recall what John Ralston Saul mentioned in terms of the use of coded language with respect to immigrants as migrants and the like, be it the abandoned child, whatever. And I always remember what my daughter told me. She was then 15 years of age, now 28, when she said to me, Daddy, if you want to know what the real test of human rights is, then always ask yourself, at any time, in any situation, in any part of the world, is it good for children? Is what is happening good for children? That's the real test of human rights, Daddy. So I would just like to close and say that when we look at the assault on human rights, wherever it may be, silence is not an option. The time has come not only to sound the alarm, but to act. At times such as these, as the French put it so well, qui s'excuse, s'accuse, that whoever remains indifferent indicts himself and herself. And so I trust that people here, inspired by the ideas in this conference, will be moved to act. So this will not only be a conference, an act of remembrance of what took place 60 years ago and since, but a remembrance to act. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
But I think the great thing is of IdeaCity as a whole, it brings together just an enormously diverse group of people with their own varied experiences, their own inspirational stories.